A suicide attack is any violent attack in which the attacker expects their own death as a direct result of the method used to harm, damage or destroy the target. Suicide attacks have occurred throughout history, often as part of a military campaign such as the Japanese kamikaze pilots of World War II, and more recently as part of terrorist campaigns, such as the September 11 attacks. While there were few, if any, successful suicide attacks anywhere in the world from the end of World War II until 1980, between 1981 and September 2015, a total of 4,814 suicide attacks occurred in over 40 countries, killing over 45,000 people. During this time, the global rate of such attacks grew from an average of 3 a year in the 1980s, to about 1 a month in the 1990s, to almost 1 a week from 2001 to 2003, to approximately 1 a day from 2003 to 2015. Suicide attacks tend to be more deadly and destructive than other terror attacks because they give their perpetrators the ability to conceal weapons, make last-minute adjustments, and because they dispense with the need for remote or delayed detonation, escape plans or rescue teams. They constituted only 4% of all terrorist attacks around the world over one period, between 1981 and 2006, but caused 32% of all terrorism-related deaths, 14,599. 90% of those attacks occurred in Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, the Palestinian territories, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Overall, as of mid-2015, about 3/4 of all suicide attacks occurred in just 3 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Suicide attacks have been described as a weapon of psychological warfare to instill fear in the target population, a strategy to eliminate or at least drastically diminish areas where the public feels safe, and the fabric of trust that holds societies together. The motivation of suicide attackers varies. Kamikaze acted under military orders and were motivated by obedience and nationalism. Before 2003, most attacks targeted forces occupying the attacker's homeland, according to analyst Robert Papa. Anthropologist Scott Atran states that since 2004 the overwhelming majority of bombers have been motivated by the ideology of Islamist martyrdom. Definitions. Terrorism. Suicide attacks include both suicide terrorism, terrorism often defined as any action intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians or non-combatants for the purpose of intimidation, and suicide attacks not targeting non-combatants. An alternative definition is provided by Jason Burke, a journalist who has lived among Islamic militants, and suggests that most define terrorism as the use or threat of serious violence to advance some kind of cause, stressing that terrorism is a tactic. Academic Fred Halliday has written that assigning the descriptor of terrorist or terrorism to the actions of a group is a tactic used by states to deny legitimacy and rights to protest and rebel. Suicide terrorism. The definition of suicide is another issue. Suicide terrorism itself has been defined by one source, Ami Padazhar, as violent actions perpetrated by people who are aware that the odds they will return alive are close to zero. Other sources exclude from their work suicidal or high-risk attacks, such as the Lod Airport massacre or reckless charge in battle, focusing only on true suicide attacks, where the odds of survival are not close to zero but required to be zero, because the perpetrator's ensured death is a precondition for the success of his mission. Also excluded from the definition are proxy bombings, which may have political goals and may be designed to look like suicide bombing, but where the proxy is forced to carry a bomb under threat, such as having his/her children killed, and may be unaware they, the proxy, will be killed, and suicidal rampage shootings, such as the Columbine High School massacre, the Virginia Tech shooting or Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in the U.S., which are usually thought of as being driven by personal/psychological, not political, social, or religious, motives. It may not always be clear to investigators which type of killing is which. Suicide attack campaigns sometimes also using proxy bombers, such as alleged in Iraq, or manipulating the vulnerable to be bombers, and at least one researcher, Adam Langford, arguing that the motivation to kill and be killed connects some suicide attackers more closely to suicidal rampage murderers than is commonly thought. Usage. The usage of the term suicide attack goes back a long way, but suicide bombing dates back to at least 1940, when a New York Times article mentions the term in relation to German tactics. Less than 2 years later, that newspaper referred to a Japanese kamikaze attempt on an American carrier as a suicide bombing. In 1945, the Times of London referred to a kamikaze plane as a suicide bomb, and 2 years later an article there referred to a new British pilotless, radio-controlled rocket missile as originally designed as a countermeasure to the Japanese suicide bomber. Alternative terms. Sometimes, to assign either a more positive or negative connotation to the act, suicide bombing is referred to by different terms. Istishhad. Islamist supporters often call a suicide attack istishhad, often translated as martyrdom operation, and the suicide attacker shaheed, pl shahada, literally witness and usually translated as martyr. The idea being that the attacker died in order to testify his faith in God, for example while waging jihad bis saif, jihad by the sword. The term suicide is never used because Islam has strong strictures against taking one's own life. The terms istishhad/martyrdom operation have been embraced by the Palestinian Authority, and by Hamas, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, Fatah, and other Palestinian factions. Homicide bombing. Some efforts have been made to replace the term suicide bombing with homicide bombing, on the grounds that since the homicide is a more apt an adjective than suicide, since the primary purpose of such a bombing is to kill other people. The first to use the term for a wide audience was White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer in April 2002. The only major media outlets to use it were Fox News Channel and the New York Post, both of which are owned by News Corporation and have since mostly abandoned the term. Emeritus Professor Robert Goldney, of the University of Adelaide, has argued in favor of the term homicide bomber, arguing that studies show that there is little in common between people who blow themselves up, intending to kill as many people as possible in the process, and actual suicide victims. Fox News producer Dennis Murray argued that a suicidal act should be reserved for a person who does something to kill themselves only. CNN producer Krista Robinson argued that the term homicide bomber reflects only that you have killed other people, but not that you have also killed yourself. Genocide bombing. Genocide bombing was coined in 2002 by Irwin Cotler, a member of the Canadian Parliament, in an effort to focus attention on the alleged intention of genocide by militant Palestinians in their calls to wipe Israel off the map. Sacrifice bombing. In the German-speaking area the term sacrifice bombing, Geopferanschlag, was proposed in 2012 by German scholar Arita Takita. The term is intended to shift the focus away from the suicide of the perpetrators and towards their use as weapons by their commanders. The 1st century AD Jewish Sicarii sect are thought to have carried out suicidal attacks against Hellenized Jews they considered immoral collaborators. The Islamic Hashishi'in, assassins, sect of Ismaili Shia Muslims assassinated 2 caliphs, and many viziers, sultans, and crusader leaders over the course of 300 years, before being annihilated by Mongol invaders. Hashishi'in were known for their targeting of the powerful, their use of the dagger as a weapon, rather than something safer for the assassin such as a crossbow, and for making no attempt to escape after completing their killing. However, this is disputed by non-Orientalist scholars who claimed that unlike the ninja or shinobi, the assassins always avoided suicide unless it was absolutely necessary, and preferred to be killed by their captors. Arnold von Winkelried became a hero in the Swiss struggle for independence when he sacrificed himself at the Battle of Sempach in 1386. The earliest known non-military suicide attack occurred in Murchison in New Zealand on July 14, 1905. A long-standing dispute between 2 farmers resulted in a court case, and the defendant, Joseph Sewell, had sticks of gelignite strapped to his body. When Sewell excitedly shouted during the court sitting about the other farmer, "I'll blow the devil to hell, and I have enough dynamite to do just that," he was ushered out of the building. Sewell detonated the charge when a police officer tried to arrest him on the street, and his body was blown to pieces, but nobody else died from their injuries. India. To counter the superior numbers of the Chola dynasty empire's army in the 11th century, suicide squads were raised by the Indian Chera rulers. This helped the Cheras to resist Chola invasion and maintain the independence of their kingdom from the time of Kulathunga Chola I. These warriors were known as the Chavars. Later, these suicide squads rendered service as police, volunteer troop, and fighting squads in the region. Now their primary duty was to assist local rulers in battles and skirmishes. The rulers of the state of Vallabhanad are known to have deployed a number of suicide squads against the ruler of Calicut. Dutch. In the late 17th century, Qing official Yu Yonghe recorded that injured Dutch soldiers fighting against Koxinga's forces for control of Taiwan in 1661 would use gunpowder to blow up both themselves and their opponents rather than be taken prisoner. However, the Chinese observer may have confused such suicidal tactics with the standard Dutch military practice of undermining and blowing up positions recently overrun by the enemy, which almost cost Koxinga his life during the siege of Fort Zeelandia. Aceh. Muslim Acenas from the Aceh Sultanate performed suicide attacks known as Parang Sabal against Dutch invaders during the Aceh War. It was considered as part of personal jihad in the Islamic religion of the Acenas. The Dutch called it a Jemoord, literally Aceh murder. The Acenas' work of literature, the Hikayat Parang Sabal, provided the background and reasoning for the Aceh Moord Acenas suicide attacks upon the Dutch. The Indonesian translations of the Dutch terms are Aceh Bodo, Aceh Pungo, or Aceh Hila, Aceh Moord. A Jemoord was also used against the Japanese by the Acenas during the Japanese occupation of Aceh. The Acenas ulama, Islamic clerics, fought against both the Dutch and the Japanese, revolting against the Dutch in February 1942 and against Japan in November 1942. The revolt was led by the All Aceh Religious Scholars Association, PUSA. The Japanese suffered 18 dead in the uprising while they slaughtered up to 100 or over 120 Acenas. The revolt happened in Bayu and was centered around Tjat Playan village's religious school. During the revolt, the Japanese troops armed with mortars and machine guns were charged by sword-wielding Acenas under Tunku Abdul Jalil, Tengku Abdul Jalil, in Buloh Gampong Tiunga and Tjat Playan on 10 and November 13. On May 1945 the Acenas rebelled again. Moro Juramantadu. Moro Muslims who performed suicide attacks were called Mag Sabal, and the suicide attacks were known as Parang Sabal. The Spanish called them Juramantadu. The idea of the Juramantadu was considered part of jihad in the Moros' Islamic religion. During an attack, a Juramantadu would throw himself at his targets and kill them with bladed weapons such as barongs and kris until he himself was killed. The Moros performed Juramantadu suicide attacks against the Spanish in the Spanish-Moro conflict of the 16th to the 19th centuries, against the Americans in the Moro Rebellion, 1899–1913, and against the Japanese in World War II. The Moro Juramantadus aimed their attacks specifically against their enemies, and not against non-Muslims in general. They launched suicide attacks on the Japanese, Spanish, Americans and Filipinos, but did not attack the non-Muslim Chinese as the Chinese were not considered enemies of the Moro people. The Japanese responded to these suicide attacks by massacring all known family members and relatives of the attackers. According to historian Stephen Dale, the Moro were not the only Muslims who carried out suicide attacks in their fight against Western hegemony and colonial rule. In the 18th century, suicide tactics were used on the Malabar coast of southwestern India, in Aceh, in northern Sumatra as well. Russia. The first known suicide bomber was Russian. The invention of dynamite in the 1860s presented revolutionary and terrorist groups in Europe with a weapon nearly 20 times more powerful than gunpowder, but with technical challenges to detonating it at the right time. One way around that obstacle was to use a human trigger, and this was the technique that assassinated Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881. A would-be suicide bomber killed Vyacheslav von Plave, the Russian Minister of the Interior, in St. Petersburg in 1904. Chinese suicide squads. During the Xinhai Revolution, the Revolution of 1911, and the warlord era of the Republic of China, 1912–1949, Dare to Die Corps, Traditional Chinese, Simplified Chinese, Pinyin, Nzdu, Wade Giles, Gongtsetui, or suicide squads were frequently used by Chinese armies. China deployed these suicide units against the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the Xinhai Revolution, many Chinese revolutionaries became martyrs in battle. Dare to Die Student Corps were founded, for student revolutionaries wanting to fight against Qing dynasty rule. Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Huang Xin promoted the Dare to Die Corps. Huang said, "We must die, so let us die bravely." Suicide squads were formed by Chinese students going into battle, knowing that they would be killed fighting against overwhelming odds. The 72 martyrs of Huang died in the uprising that began the Wuchang Uprising, and were recognized as heroes and martyrs by the Kuomintang Party and the Republic of China. The martyrs in the Dare to Die Corps who died in battle wrote letters to family members before heading off to certain death. The Huanghuakeng was built as a monument to the 72 martyrs. The deaths of the revolutionaries helped the establishment of the Republic of China, overthrowing the Qing dynasty imperial system. Other Dare to Die student corps in the Xinhai Revolution were led by students who later became major military leaders in Republic of China, like Chiang Kai-shek, and Huang Shaoxiang with the Muslim Bai Kongzi against Qing dynasty forces. Dare to Die troops were used by warlords. The Kuomintang used one to put down an insurrection in Canton. Many women joined them in addition to men to achieve martyrdom against China's opponents. They were known as Lit Shi, martyrs, after accomplishing their mission. During the January 28 incident, a Dare to Die squad struck against the Japanese. Suicide bombing was also used against the Japanese. A Dare to Die corps was effectively used against Japanese units at the Battle of Taichuang. They used swords. They wore suicide vests made out of grenades. A Chinese soldier detonated a grenade vest and killed 20 Japanese soldiers at Sihang warehouse. Chinese troops strapped explosives like grenade packs or dynamite to their bodies and threw themselves under Japanese tanks to blow them up. This tactic was used during the Battle of Shanghai, to stop a Japanese tank column when an attacker exploded himself beneath the lead tank, and at the Battle of Taichuang where Chinese troops with dynamite and grenades strapped to themselves rushed Japanese tanks and blew themselves up, in one incident obliterating 4 Japanese tanks with grenade bundles. During the 1946–1950 Communist Revolution, coolies fighting the Communists formed Dare to Die Corps to fight for their organizations, with their lives. During the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989, protesting students also formed Dare to Die Corps, to risk their lives defending the protest leaders. Japanese kamikaze. Kamikaze, a ritual act of self-sacrifice carried out by Japanese pilots of explosive-laden aircraft against Allied warships, occurred on a large scale at the end of World War II. About 3,000 attacks were made and about 50 ships were sunk. Later in the war, as Japan became more desperate, this act became formalized and ritualized, as planes were outfitted with explosives specific to the task of a suicide mission. Kamikaze strikes were a weapon of asymmetric war used by the Empire of Japan against United States Navy and Royal Navy aircraft carriers, although the armored flight deck of the Royal Navy carriers diminished kamikaze effectiveness. The Japanese Navy also used piloted torpedoes called Kaiten, Heaven Shaker, on suicide missions. Although sometimes called midget submarines, these were modified versions of the unmanned torpedoes of the time and are distinct from the torpedo-firing midget submarines used earlier in the war, which were designed to infiltrate shore defenses and return to a mothership after firing their torpedoes. Although extremely hazardous, these midget submarine attacks were not technically suicide missions, as the earlier midget submarines had escape hatches. Kaitens, however, provided no means of escape. Germans. During the Battle for Berlin, the Luftwaffe flew self-sacrifice missions, Selbstopfereinsatz, against Soviet bridges over the River Oder. These total missions were flown by pilots of the Leonidas Squadron. From April 1720, 1945, using any available aircraft, the Luftwaffe claimed the squadron had destroyed 17 bridges. However, military historian Antony Beevor, when writing about the missions, thinks that this was exaggerated and that only the railway bridge at Kustrin was definitely destroyed. He comments that 35 pilots and aircraft was a high price to pay for such a limited and temporary success. The missions were called off when the Soviet ground forces reached the vicinity of the squadron's airbase at Jüterbog. Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf intended to assassinate Adolf Hitler by suicide bomb in 1943, but was unable to complete the attack. Korean War. North Korean tanks were attacked by South Koreans with suicide tactics during the Korean War. American tanks at Seoul were attacked by North Korean suicide squads, who used satchel charges. North Korean soldier Lee So-bok is considered a hero for destroying an American tank with a suicide bomb. Suez Crisis. An Arab Christian military officer from Syria, Jules Jamal, allegedly brought down a French ship with a suicide attack during the Suez Crisis in 1956, according to Egyptian media, although both French ships with that name were unharmed during the crisis. Post-1980 attacks. History. The concept of self-sacrifice as a means to killing others dates back to antiquity with Samson's suicidal mass killing of the Philistine leaders, but the idea of suicide bombing as a tool of stateless terrorists was only dreamed up 100 years ago by the European anarchists, according to author Noah Feldman. It was not until 1983, when Shiite militants blew up the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon, that it became a tool of modern terrorist warfare. Modern suicide bombing has been defined as involving explosives deliberately carried to the target either on the person or in a civilian vehicle and delivered by surprise. Noah Feldman and many others exclude terror attacks such as the Lod Airport massacre, where the perpetrator's ensured death was not a precondition for the success of his mission. The intended targets are often civilian, not just military or political. Suicide bombing was used by factions of the Lebanese civil war and especially by the Tamil Tigers, LTTE, of Sri Lanka. The Islamic Dawa Party's car bombing of the Iraqi embassy in Beirut in December 1981 and Hezbollah's bombing of the U.S. Embassy in April 1983, an attack on United States Marine and French barracks in October 1983 brought suicide bombing's international attention. Other parties to the civil war were quick to adopt the tactic, and by 1999 factions such as Hezbollah, the Amal movement, the Ba'ath Party, and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party had carried out around 50 suicide bombings between them. The latter of these groups sent the first recorded female suicide bomber in 1985. During the Sri Lankan Civil War, the Tamil Tigers, LTTE, adopted suicide bombing as a tactic, using bomb belts and female bombers. The LTTE carried out their first suicide attack in July 1987, and their Black Tiger unit committed 83 suicide attacks from 1987 to 2009, killing 981 people, including former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, and the President of Sri Lanka, Ranil Wickremesinghe. Another non-religious group involved in suicide attacks was the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which began their insurgency against the Turkish state in 1984. According to the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism Suicide Attack Database, as of 2015, 10 suicide attacks by the PKK from 1996 to 2012 killed 32 people and injured 116. Suicide attacks are only part of the PKK's militant arsenal, as they have killed or wounded hundreds of government workers and destroyed or damaged hundreds of school, post offices, and mosques. Al-Qaeda carried out its first suicide attack in the mid-1990s, and they first appeared in Israel and the Palestinian territories in 1989. 9/11 and after. In early 2000, one analyst, Joram Schweitzer, saw a pause in bombing campaigns and argued that most of the groups that were involved in suicide terrorism either stopped using it or eventually reduced it significantly. The number of attacks using suicide tactics grew from an average of fewer than 5 per year during the 1980s to 81 suicide attacks in 2001 to 460 in 2005. By 2005, the tactic had spread to dozens of countries. Suicide bombing became a popular tactic among Palestinian militant organizations such as Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and occasionally by the PFLP. The first suicide bombing in Israel was by Hamas in 1994. Attacks peaked from 2001-2003 with over 40 bombings and over 200 killed in 2002. Bombers affiliated with these groups often use so-called suicide belts, explosive devices, often including shrapnel, designed to be strapped to the body under clothing. In order to maximize the loss of life, the bombers seek out enclosed spaces, such as cafes or city buses crowded with people at rush hour. Less common are military targets, for example, soldiers waiting for transport at roadside. These bombings have tended to have more popular support than in other Muslim countries, and more music videos and announcements that promise eternal reward for suicide bombers can be found on Palestinian television, according to Palestinian Media Watch. Israeli sources alleged that Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah operate paradise camps, training children as young as 11 to become suicide bombers. The September 11, 2001 attacks, orchestrated by Al-Qaeda, has been called the worst attack on American soil since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which thrust the United States into World War II. They involved the hijacking of 4 large passenger jets because their long cross-country flight plans meant they carried more fuel, allowing a bigger explosion on impact. Unlike earlier airline hijackings, the primary focus was the planes, not the passengers. 2 were deliberately flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, destroying both 110-story skyscrapers within less than 2 hours. And the third into the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia, causing severe damage to the west side of the building. These attacks resulted in the deaths of 221 people, including the 15 hijackers, on board the 3 planes, as well as 2,731 more in and around the targeted buildings. A 4th plane crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after a revolt by the plane's passengers, killing all 44 people, including the 4 hijackers, on board. In total, the attacks killed 2,996 people and injured more than 6,000 others. The U.S. stock market closed for 4 trading days after the attacks, the first time it had an unscheduled closing since the Great Depression. 9 days after the attack, U.S. President George W. Bush called for a war on terror and shortly thereafter launched the war in Afghanistan to find and capture Osama bin Laden, the head of the Al-Qaeda organization that mounted the 9/11 attacks. After the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iraqi and foreign insurgents carried out waves of suicide bombings. More attacks have been carried out in Iraq, 1938 as of mid-2015, than in any other country. In addition to United States military targets, they attacked many civilian targets such as Shiite mosques, international offices of the UN and the Red Cross. Iraqi men waiting to apply for jobs with the new army and police force were targets. In the lead-up to the Iraqi parliamentary election, on January 30, 2005, suicide attacks upon civilian and police personnel involved with the elections increased. There were also reports of the insurgents co-opting disabled people as involuntary suicide bombers. Other major locations of suicide attack are Afghanistan, 1,059 attacks as of mid-2015, and Pakistan, 490 attacks. In the first 8 months of 2008, Pakistan overtook Iraq and Afghanistan in suicide bombings, with 28 bombings killing 471 people. Suicide bombings have become a tactic in Chechnya, first being used in the conflict in 2000 in Al-Khankala, and spreading to Russia, notably with the Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2002 to the Beslan school hostage crisis in 2004. In Europe, 4 Islamist suicide bombers exploded homemade peroxide explosives on 3 London Underground trains and a bus on July 7, 2005, during the morning rush hour. These 7/7 bombings killed 52 civilians and injured 700. Since 2006, Al-Shabaab and its predecessor, the Islamic Courts, have carried out major suicide attacks in Somalia, the worst year so far being 2014 with 16 attacks and over 120 killed. Weapons and methods. Means of suicide attack in the 20th and 21st centuries include on foot, explosive belt, satchel charge, many, including the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. With a plane as target and explosives hidden inside attacker's shoe, Richard Reed on American Airlines Flight 63. With explosives hidden inside the body, 2009 attack on a Saudi prince, Mohammed bin Nayef. By car bomb, 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, Sri Lankan central bank bombing, numerous incidents in Iraq since 2003. By a boat with explosives, USS Cole bombing attacks in Aden, Yemen by Al-Qaeda, SLNS Sagarawardena sinking in Sri Lanka by Tamil Tigers. By a submarine with explosives, human-steered torpedo Kaiten, used by Japan in World War II. By a bicycle with explosives, assassination of Sri Lankan President Ranasinghe Premadasa by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE. By a hijacked commercial jet airliner with fuel, September 11 attacks, possibly Air France Flight 8969 and attempted by Samuel Bike. By private plane, 2010 Austin plane crash. By diverting a bus to an abyss, Tel Aviv-Jerusalem bus 405 attack. By a car by using a fast-driving car to drive intentionally into a crowd of people or breaching a security barrier, 2009 attack on the Dutch royal family. Strategy and advantages. According to author Jeffrey William Lewis, to succeed, campaigns of suicide bombing need willing individuals, organizations to train and use them, a society willing to accept such acts in the name of a greater good. The organizations work to guarantee individual suicide bombers that they will be remembered as martyrs dying for their communities. By imbuing suicide bombing/attacks with reverence and heroism, it becomes more attractive to recruits. According to Joram Schweitzer, modern suicide terrorism is aimed at causing devastating physical damage, through which it inflicts profound fear and anxiety. Its goal is not to produce a negative psychological effect only on the victims of the actual attack, but on the entire target population. Attackers themselves have often framed suicide attacks as acts of courageous self-sacrifice and made necessary by the superior military or security strength of the enemy. The technique has also been called the atomic weapon of the weak. According to Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the former leader of Hamas, once we have warplanes and missiles, then we can think of changing our means of legitimate self-defense. But right now, we can only tackle the fire with our bare hands and sacrifice ourselves. While arguably this explains the motivation of many early suicide bombings in the 1980s and 90s, it cannot explain many later attacks, such as on funeral processions of the minority Shia in Pakistan. A major reason for the popularity of suicide attacks despite the sacrifice involved for its perpetrators is its tactical advantages over other types of terrorism. The ability to conceal weapons, make last-minute adjustments, increased ability to infiltrate heavily guarded targets, lack of need for remote or delayed detonation, escape plans or rescue teams. Robert Papa observes, suicide attacks are.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.